said yes, and then students don't have to figure out anything. So the church offered, but I don't know.
Okay. Is the microphone working in the back? No. All right. It's not working. I can see it working from here to there. Alternate audio source. How about that? Is that working? That's working. Okay, cool. Thanks. Okay. Thanks, everybody. This is a much different day than Wednesday when we were joking about Russia and Ukraine, and now the world has drastically changed. And anyways, these are troubling, disturbing times. The threat of World War III coming back, giving me flashbacks to the 80s. Okay, so today we've got a lot to talk about. We're going to talk about the Constitution. In a way, we're going to try to answer one of Ali Weber's questions, I think. Is that right? Let me just double check. Pack back. All right. Okay, thank you. Useless thing. All right. It is Ali's question. I'm not going to be able to pull it up. About Federalist 10. What is Federalist 10? Where does it come from? What's its relationship to the Revolution and the Constitution? And how successful is it? So let's take a whirlwind tour through the end of the Revolution and the birth of the Constitution. After the Revolution is successful at Yorktown, we see attacks on loyalists. Loyalists are driven out. People who decidedly supported the British side in the Revolution are in South Carolina. Their property is seized. In other states as well, their property is taken from them by authorized by the new states. Many of them end up in Canada, in what's now Toronto. A continental currency had been issued during the Revolution that had tried to be the thing that the newly formed Confederation would use to pay soldiers with and to pay for other supplies. This continental currency, though, was not backed by any taxing authority on the part of the Constitution. It was not backed by gold and silver. To make matters even worse with the continental currency, the British government discovered that this currency was the thing that the sort of developing United States under the Articles of Confederation was trying to use, and so they quickly, British generals quickly copied it and reproduced it, making counterfeit continental dollars, which were widely circulated. And so these continental dollars are basically what we see as runaway inflation inside the American government. Finally, after some vestiges of taxing authority return under the Constitution, the 100-to-1 Act declares that $1 American will be paid for each $100 of continental currency. As you can imagine, the people who are using this currency to buy their groceries with, to support their families with, are kind of broken by this, and it leads to a great deal of conflict, consternation, concern that this Confederation is not going to last. The other thing that happens in the Confederation period is what's called Shaza's Rebellion. And this is as the Articles of Confederation as the various states try to start taxing, the way it's supposed to work is that the states themselves are going to pay back debts to the federal government. The states have to enforce their taxation. Virginia doesn't do this. South Carolina doesn't do this. Georgia doesn't do this. But Massachusetts and other states try to begin to pay back their debts to the Continental Congress, and in doing so, create a series of taxes that they impose on artisans. And there's a tool tax, and there's a window tax, and all these other sorts of things. And Shaza, who is a kind of a day laborer, and others, but people who had been familiar with the use of arms during the Revolution, had been involved in the militia, they create a kind of anti-tax revolt, and they try to basically capture the armory and bring about a revolt against the state. Oh, sorry, bear with me a second. I've lost my tablet. Okay. When will we receive our test scores? The plan for the test scores is Monday, as I said before. Happy Friday. Thanks, everybody. All right. And somewhere between here and... there it is. Okay. Okay. February 25th. Okay. All right. I am not going to freak out about events in the world. Okay, so it's in this context of runaway inflation and the problems with the Continental Congress, their inability to effectively tax the debts that are owed by the individual states. There's some other things that happen before we start talking about a constitution. One is that the franchise expands. Political participation rates double from the beginning to the end of this conflict. American veterans came home demanding the right to vote in their states. As constitutions were written in the colonies, many became more democratic than their colonial constitutions had been, allowing citizenship to be available to those with even the smallest amount of property. As loyalists were expelled, some of the best colonial land was made available. Franchise expanded, but there wasn't, that is, voting expanded, but it was not a universal franchise. But many more white men could vote, and black men could vote after the war than before. This was increasingly true in Massachusetts and New York, for example. And Pennsylvania. New men in politics, you saw shoemakers and soldiers become senators. This disturbs men like Madison and Jefferson, who are looking back to a republic of letters that preceded the war, the times of the Sons of Liberty, and they're a little bit concerned that these kind of new folks are arriving. Deference is really gone. The deference to one's betters, quote unquote, really goes away. So, Washington and others created a secret order called the Order of the Cincinnati. Cincinnatus was a Roman senator who, took his sword and took his plowshare, turned it into a sword, and then after the war was over, took his sword and turned it back into a plowshare. The Order of the Cincinnati that he created, though, was an officers' club, secret society with secret handshakes and signs, and a lot of soldiers and militia members and others were extremely upset about the Order of the Cincinnati. And attackers, including Sam Adams, claimed that this was an attempt to create a hereditary military nobility. Throughout the colonies, there are attacks on places like the Order of Cincinnati, as attacks as well, on the institutions that the colonial social elite took for granted, like plays, operas, cotillions, and balls. Virtue was redefined in this period. Virtue had previously meant being above politics, but it increasingly meant those who were not kind of wealthy, that it was the kind of self-supporting farmer and others that were virtuous, whereas the wealthy and the large landholders were not. Okay, so some other events that take place. Where are we? Enslaved men and women successfully sue for their freedom in Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Vermont in the courts during this period. In Virginia, we see it's religious conflict that emerges, where Baptists, in particular, resent paying taxes to support the Anglican Church. The College of William and Mary, for example, was supported by taxes, but it was designed to train Anglican ministers primarily. And people resented paying these taxes that seemed to support the Anglican Church, which had been the church of the elite. And so this becomes one of Jefferson's the thing that helps him rise to power in Virginia is his opposition to these taxes for the Anglican Church. Jefferson and others say the Anglican Church is basically a British church. It's effectively just like the Church of England. And Baptists and Methodists push back against this sort of state-supported religion. And we see something that becomes very important for the future country, but it starts in Virginia, and that's the separation of church and state. That no religious institutions will be bound to this state. It becomes part of Virginia's Constitution and ultimately becomes part of the U.S. Constitution. Jefferson thinks it's one of the most important things that he's ever done. He has it put on his tombstone that he was the person who pushed most strongly for the separation of church and state. And the supporters of this were the Baptists and the Methodists. It's kind of ironic. You might think that this was the atheists or something, but it's not. It's Baptists and Methodists who think the Anglicans have too much power in Virginia. Part of the Iroquois Confederation, under Joseph Brant, left for Canada, and others moved to permanent reservations in New York. Those reservations are still there, some of them, although they're smaller. The Cherokees and the Creeks moved to reservations in West Georgia. But these reservations, as you can probably guess, would not be permanent. But from the 1770s to the 1830s, they would exist. So those are some of the other effects of the revolution. The fiscal problem, though. Fiscal problem is the problem of the debt, of the inability to collect taxes, because the Constitution doesn't provide a kind of way to collect taxes. We see calls for some sort of new government. Some of the problems with the Confederation, as I said, are an inflationary currency with no taxation, the possibility of revolts in the states, Indian treaties not being obeyed. There was radical anti-Indian violence that came after 1787. Many former soldiers moved into Iroquois country to attack Indians who had supported the British. In South Carolina, Georgia, and backwoods, settlers saw the revolution as a kind of carte blanche for taking Indian land. Indian treaties not obeyed is the third effect of the revolution. Now, it's not that Americans didn't want to take that land. They did, but they wanted to be organized. They wanted there to be a treaty. They wanted not to be a kind of justification for a kind of endless border violence. The Continental Congress, weak and decentralized as it was unable to make treaties with the Indians to prevent the violence. The fourth thing is they can't make trade agreements. There's no treaty power for European nations, and Britain refuses to move out of some of the important outposts in the north, even though they sign a peace treaty. Also, there are competing legislative powers. After the war, British goods, part of the consumer revolution I talked about before, all these British goods that people liked, the tea and the China and these other things that came through Britain, began to flood the American colonies. And this upset many artisans. There's a question here. Oh, no. This upset many artisans because states tried to erect tariff barriers, right? Barriers to these foreign goods. If you're an artisan like Sam Adams, you're producing silver, and this cheap silver plate is coming in from Great Britain, you want to stop it. But it's so easy to move goods from state to state. Massachusetts can establish a tariff, but then the goods can come in from Pennsylvania and just cross the border. So artisans and small manufacturers became convinced that the only way to stop the inflow of British goods and the outflow of American gold and silver was to have a strong national state that would make tariff decisions and actually enforce them. Okay, the most radical Pennsylvania Constitution was in Pennsylvania, and this was in part because the Quakers had controlled Philadelphia, but many of the Quakers had supported the British or refused to fight because they were Quakers. Quakers don't fight, don't take up arms. And so what happens is you get merchants, very small merchants and mechanics who take over Philadelphia, and they basically abolish the Pennsylvania Senate, and they create just one big House of Representatives because they think that the Pennsylvania Senate is a monarchical institution. The most radical constitution was in Pennsylvania. The revolutionary structure in the US as it's established in the states, besides Pennsylvania, is basically this, something like this. The king will be replaced by a governor who will have executive powers. The lords will be replaced by a senate. And the people will be represented, the common people will be represented in the House of Representatives. Okay. So this then is what's happening in each of the individual states, with the exception of Pennsylvania, is this attempt to kind of map the old British Empire in a way that looks familiar, but is also more democratic. Okay, so in September 1786, the delegates gathered. Delegates are sent from some of the states to discuss what to do with interstate commerce. That's all they're there to do. Only 9 of the 13 states agree to attend. Only 5 actually show up. Alexander Hamilton prepares an address calling for a convention to resolve this problem, and basically this initial meeting becomes what we now call the Constitutional Convention. There are a few things that help this along, and maybe the most important is the arrival of George Washington, who decides that to show up for this meeting, which vastly increases the respectability of this group. While people don't like the Order of the Cincinnati, they trust Washington himself, especially the radical soldiers and militiamen who are in these in these states. Their hero of the war, as they see it, is showing up. James Madison brings his design for a constitution, and no one rivals him for working the convention floor, schmoozing with the delegates from the other states, working out compromises. Jefferson is in France trying to work out trade treaties. Patrick Henry refuses to go because he suspects that it's a plot to make a centralized government, and he's right. The people who meet at the Constitutional Convention seek to contain what they see as an excess of democracy in the states. And they try to create a federal government that's more centralized. They say, in effect, we were wrong to stray too far from the British system in this Articles of Confederation. Because the Articles of Confederation, under the Articles of Confederation, there's no Senate really in that body. It's just a House. They said we shouldn't have abolished this. We shouldn't have just a House. We should have a Senate as well, something like the House of Lords. We were wrong to give up a central executive with kingly powers. Let's go back. But the trouble is, no one is prepared really to fully go back to the British system. Particularly a British system where only 1 in 32 men could vote. Instead, they end up with a compromise between the localized democracy of the House with a return to something like the British system of parliamentary and monarchic control, this time though with an elected king rather than, elected president rather than a king. The two groups that line up against one another are the Federalists then. So basically this Constitution is suggested by Madison. It's argued over in the Constitutional Convention, and then it's sent out to the states for ratification. Two groups emerge, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And this is the terms are funny and confusing because the Federalists tended to support, well, did support the Constitution. And the word federalism means that you support divided power by states. So the Federalists sort of chose the high ground. They knew that this idea of a centralized state was not popular, so they chose the term Federalists. And the people who opposed this new Constitution are called the Anti-Federalists. It's the most confusing thing in the world, but effectively, Federalists support the Constitution, Anti-Federalists oppose it, if that makes sense. That makes sense? Okay, both of them, though, have a kind of ideology about a kind of understanding of the world, a kind of language that they share. And one source of that language is what's called real Whig ideology. And that's the language of the real Whigs. So in Britain, you've got the Whigs who tend to be uncomfortable with the king's power, uncomfortable with the king's control of the currency, uncomfortable with too much centralized power. On the other side, you have the Tories, people who support the king and are in general, support the kind of centralization of the British Empire. Those are the Whigs and the Tories, so that's how politics in Britain works. The so-called real Whigs tended to be people who thought both parties were corrupt, and they used this language of corruption to attack their enemies. They were called the backbenchers, people who sat in the back and both criticized both parties. The real Whigs were the people for very early on in Britain who supported the American Revolution, who believed that the Britain should cut off its connection to the colonies. And so this real Whig language of corruption and virtue and dangers to the Republic and monarchy are an important language that both supporters and opponents of the Constitution share. The way in which they frame matters is liberty versus power. Liberty expressed by the small farmer who ought to be left to his own devices, ought to be have minimal control, and the powerful voluptuary on the other side, the person who is devoted to withdrawing taxes and charging rent and corrupting the body politic to benefit themselves. So this language of liberty versus power is a really powerful kind of divide. And so Federalists say that what we're trying to do is defend liberty, but we need a state to do that. To prevent the power of individual sort of elites from controlling the states, and the only way to do that is to create a power above those two. Anti-Federalists use the same thing, but they say these people, the people who support liberty, are threatened by a strong national state. And the people who support a strong national state are the voluptuaries. Does that make sense? So they're both using this sort of language of, good liberty, virtue on the one side, evil, power, voluptuary, abuse of power on the other. And this language is with us today. It's still with us. It's at this point that the Federalist Papers and the debates over the Constitution, once the Constitution is drafted and it goes out to the states for ratification, there is a series, it's basically a pamphlet war between the supporters of the Constitution, the Federalists, and the opponents of the Constitution, the Anti-Federalists. And key to this is James Madison, who draws this up. And Allie's question is, does Federalist 10 work? And this is my question too. Here's Federalist 10. The language is really hard to follow, and I should have not used black on blue, but let me just read you this. He talks about the difference between a democracy and a republic. This is Federalist number 10. A democracy can enlarge public views by passing them through citizens. Democracy is direct democracy, but it's potentially dangerous. A republic, on the other hand, refines people's views by running them through an organization of elected bodies. The problem is there are two dangers. If the republic is too small, then a few factions will control a state, and what he's talking about is, for example, the Dutch Republic, where a few families seem to have tremendous power. So small republics are maybe dangerous. What he argues in Federalist 10 is a large republic avoids that problem. If there's a lot of people in the republic, then one group of voluptuaries or critics or antagonists to liberty will compete against another. And if you have enough of those people, maybe you'll have something like democracy, something like freedom, something like liberty. Does that make sense? So if you've got competing elites, then you're safe. You'll never avoid the problem of people not being virtuous. You'll never avoid the problem of people trying to take advantage of the state and use it to their own benefits. But maybe a large state can prevent this because elites will fight against each other. This is Federalist, the central principle of Federalist 10, is that a big state, one of the central principles is that a big state may prevent factions from emerging and prevent those factions from controlling the state and moving it in one direction. It's a lovely theory, but it doesn't work quite the way that Madison believes. Federalist papers are written by somebody who calls themselves Publius, and it's actually three people, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison. And it's only using, it's relatively recently that we figured out who wrote which one. They wrote these names, they wrote the names, they wrote as Publius with assumed names for a couple of reasons, but perhaps the most important was the fear that if the revolution continued the way it was going, if people who had favored a centralized government lost, then a revolutionary tribunal might come along and kill them, right? People might go after. If the Articles of Confederation had stayed, if the Constitution had not been passed, the fear was that this revolutionary mob would round up Federalists and hang them. That was the fear, in part. And this is partly why they write under assumed names. The Anti-Federalists, on the other hand, are critics of the Constitution who argue that it gave too much power to the general government, or that there weren't enough restraints on that power. And these included Brutus, Federal Farmer, and Cato, who I had named, but I can't, I've got the wrong font here. There are basically a number of people who opposed this strong centralized government, the Anti-Federalists. And ultimately, what we get, this is where we get the Bill of Rights. This is where we get the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Each of these amendments designed to restrain the power of the state. So the Constitution gives a central government more power. It divides it up between the legislative, executive, and judicial branch. But the Bill of Rights says, hold on, and this comes in part from the criticism of the Anti-Federalists, hold on, there's certain things you can't do, right? You can't, the Second Amendment says that there has to be a militia. The Fifth Amendment says that you are entitled to due process of law at all times. And you can't be forced to incriminate yourself. That's all the way back to the Star Chamber, all the way back to the danger of a centralized executive which forces people to confess. Okay. This is a whirlwind tour of the Constitution. I apologize. Ultimately, the Constitution is passed by the states. They recognize there's enough different people who recognize that the current Confederation system is in danger, and also that the U.S. could be threatened by foreign powers, not least France, which wants its money paid back and is not getting it anytime soon, money for having supported the revolution. Okay. Now, the thing though, so this is the plan. After the Federalist Party succeeds, Federalist faction, I guess, the supporters of the Constitution succeed after the Constitution is passed, the Anti-Federalists more or less go away, and we're back to one party. The fear at the time was that a two-party system was dangerous because it would concentrate factions. But just as the Constitution is being settled, there's a new source of controversy. And this is going to create a new party divide between the Federalists on the one hand and the Republicans on the other. Now, to make things just as confusing, the Republicans are also called the Democrats. So they were technically Democratic Republicans. And I want to give you a little bit of a sense of how this conflict between our first party system emerges. And to do that, we need to understand this guy, William Dewar. Okay, so the Federalists win. The Anti-Federalists move into the woodwork, more or less. They aren't, it's not that they're, they continue to exist, but there's no real Anti-Federalist party. There's no real organized Anti-Federalist organization. But what we're going to see is Alexander Hamilton and John Jay on one side and James Madison on another in this new party divide that comes after the Constitution. Publius is going to be split in half. And the reason for that is this guy, William Dewar. We know that the tension, probably if you've seen the musical Hamilton, you know that the tension between Hamilton on the one side and Jefferson on the other is important. But to understand that, we need to understand this guy. This is William Dewar, who is the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. And he supports, as Philo Publius, he writes his own piece, that there has to be a way of resolving all this debt. You just can't create a constitution. You need to create a bank to support it. And so Colonel William Dewar had been a military contractor and land speculator. He was owed some money by the federal government. He's the assistant to the Treasury Secretary. And he supports a Bank of the United States as a way of resolving the debt. Jefferson isn't comfortable with creating a bank, a central bank. He says a centralized executive, a House, a Senate, and a presidency, a Supreme Court, all these things are fine, a balance of powers, but to bring in an outside organization like the Bank of the United States is potentially dangerous. And so there are people that oppose the bank, that support the Constitution, but oppose this Bank of the United States. In the first meeting of The new Congress under the Constitution, Alexander Hamilton and William Dewar provide free stock to people who will support a First Bank of the United States. So he proposes it and then gives stock to the people who support him. Does that make sense? So he buys almost half of Congress with this stock. Luckily, that kind of corruption doesn't happen in Washington now, but there was a time. Jefferson sees this. Jefferson sees that numerous people who had said that they would not support a Bank of the United States are appalled because the Bank of the United States the charter comes before Congress, and the people who support the charter for this Bank of the United States already own stock in it, at a time when it's very hard to get stock in the Bank of the United States. What's a bank? So I think it's important to kind of understand what a bank does to really understand how a bank can be as powerful as it is. This is an image of the Bank of England, just to give you a sense of what a bank is about. A bank is an organization that, among other things in the 18th century anyways, issues currency which stands in for gold. So this banker here on the left, as you can see, has gold under his table. This is the classic bank vault of millions of spy thrillers and things like this. This bank vault holds gold and silver. But the bank issues banknotes to stand in for this gold and silver. And those banknotes are convenient, right? Because you don't need to carry gold around. If you get mugged, banknotes have a number on them. If you open up your wallet and look at a dollar bill or a $20 bill, it still has a number on it. Each banknote has a unique number on it. And if you get robbed in the 18th century, you could produce a newspaper article that says my stuff was stolen. 3 $20 bills were taken from me, and these are their numbers, right? And then dollars are kind of safe. They're a stand-in. But what's important about banks, though, is that they have more gold than they have notes, right? Sorry, they issue more notes than they have gold, right? So a somewhat safe bank will have 50 pounds worth, let's say £1 million worth of gold underneath the vault, and issue 2 million pounds worth of notes. Does that make sense? The expectation being that not everybody is going to come back to the bank and demand their gold at the same time. Does that make sense? Okay. Now for banks, banks are much more complicated enterprises in the 21st century, but there's still this, what's called a reserve ratio, which is how much actual currency they have in relation to the currency that they're issuing. This is very powerful, very important. It makes banks trustworthy because they have the gold in the vault. You know that you can go back at some time and get it. But banks are constantly concerned about their reputation because if everybody rushes back to turn in their notes, the bank will fail. And some people won't get their gold. All right, that's basically why banks are great things if you can run them. The important thing, though, is that those banks need to make money with if you look to his left, the real money maker for a bank, though, are those notes on the left wrapped with red tape. Those notes are loans to other people. Because what banks do is they take this gold, they issue these certificates, and then they loan that money to others, right, for 90 days or 180 days, or they're not usually 10-year loans, they're short-term loans. And they charge an interest rate of 7 or 8 or 9%, relatively high by our standards, relatively low by the standards of the 18th century. And that's the real moneymaker, right, is those notes on the left, because there you're actually making more money over time. Does that make sense? Right? So you're issuing this currency to a merchant who you trust. The merchant borrows it at 7% and then pays you back in installments in a space of 2 or 3 months. That make sense? Okay, that's why you can. If all you had was gold and all you issued was paper notes, the bank would not probably succeed. It needs to be able to lend money as well as issue currency for its notes. And so this is how the Bank of the United States becomes a powerful financial institution, because it links merchants to the institution, merchants who need credit, links them to the state enterprise, and links them to doer. I want to talk about the celebrity death match between Battle of the Foreheads between Hamilton and Jefferson. The borrowers in this banking system are merchants and the United States government. The United States government needs to borrow to build roads, to support armies, to just for basic infrastructure. It's ultimately going to collect it back in taxes, but it needs the money now for later. So 50% of the loans in the Bank of the United States go to merchants, 50% go to the government. Who's lending the bank the money? Where's it getting its gold from? How is it possible for it to have gold under the desk? The lenders are English merchants and Dutch merchants in particular, who take stock in the Bank of the United States, which pays them back in interest at about 5%. So they're lending at 5%, the bank is borrowing at 5%, the bank is in turn lending at 7 to 10%, and this is sort of how the Bank of the United States operates. It's very important for understanding, doer, because Dewar's scheme to create a first Bank of the United States, Hamilton's scheme to create a Bank of the United States, makes Dewar one of the wealthiest men in the United States. He travels around. He knows that under the Constitution that state debt, state loans, state bonds are going to have to be repaid, and the U.S. government is going to pay them back because the Bank of the United States is going to pay off all of its debts. He knows this, and 3 days beforehand, he has a ship that travels around Virginia, Pennsylvania, and elsewhere and buys up all the bonds at pennies on the dollar so that he's the one who's paid back, right, by the first Bank of the United States. The nation's first millionaire is probably William Dewar. For Jefferson and Madison, this is unacceptable. We now have this person who has corrupted the legislature, created a Bank of the United States, and whatever positive benefits this institution has, it clearly has way too much power. Jefferson says, this is a machine for the corruption of the legislature. And this is how we get the Democratic Party, the so-called Democratic Republicans. A meeting is arranged between Chancellor Livingston, who lives in New York, James Madison, and Thomas Jefferson. And they go on what's called a botanizing excursion in 1791 to look for, to basically look at flowers, and in particular to look for the Hessian fly, which is at this time eating up wheat crops in upstate New York. But what they're actually doing is building the first party system. Building a party system to oppose the Federalists who are now in power. To oppose a party system that's run by Alexander Hamilton, and whose chief beneficiary is William Dewar. Is the bank borrowing from the government or the other way around? The bank is actually lending to the government. It's not borrowing from the government, it's lending to the government. The place that the bank is borrowing from is British merchants and Dutch merchants. Okay, in April of 1792, sorry about the font here, Dewar tries to buy up all US 6% bonds. He's got this scheme, this kind of elaborate scheme, which I won't go into detail with, which is to make him even richer than he already is. He knows that people who have stock in the Bank of the United States are going to quickly need to buy bonds. He then speculates on the increase of the value of those bonds. Chancellor Livingston and others tell their friends to withdraw all their money from New York banks in April of 1792, just for a week or 2 weeks. What this does is cripple the banking system, and also cripples Dewar, because he has loans with these banks. When people withdraw their gold, the banks then ask Dewar to instantly pay, right? Dewar is borrowing from them to speculate on the rise in the price of the stock of the Bank of the United States. And he can't pay them. The banks fail. The Democratic Republicans think that this is an awesome idea until we see a financial depression that emerges in 1793. It's called the Panic of 1793. It's a gold shortage. They raise the rates to borrow to 30% or more. Dewar ends up in debtor's prison. But what no one really predicts is the tremendous financial downturn that's going to follow in 1790. It's not that tremendous. 1793 and 94 there's a drop in, it's an increase in unemployment. A lot of people who have money in their banks go under. It's around this time that, to raise revenue, Hamilton taxes whiskey, and the whiskey revolts take place. The thing that ultimately bails out the Bank of the United States, the thing that ultimately bails out the United States, is that there's another revolution happening, and this one's in France. And the French Revolution, the terror begins in France in 1793, in which the kind of revolutionary energies that have started in the French Revolution have reached their peak. Leaders of the revolution are executed, like Robespierre. The king is executed. People with capital in Europe are freaked out. And they need to put their money someplace safe. And across the Atlantic suddenly seems like a pretty safe place to put your money. It hadn't before, it hadn't for 8 or 9 years, but the French Revolution is going to be a boon to the United States, a boon to the Bank of the United States. Right, so Dewar and Livingston were not on the same side. Dewar was a Federalist. Chancellor Livingston was a Democratic Republican. So the first party system grows out of an alliance between elites, an alliance between Virginia planters and New York landowners. Federalist 10 is proved wrong. It turns out that sometimes elites can agree and build a party system. This becomes the basis of, this tension is going to become the basis of the two-party system that's going to continue to the present. All right, thanks so much. Sorry to go over. Oh, one more thing to everybody. It looks like the CDC is going to make changes to mask regulations today. If that happens, and it looks like it's acceptable, we might go to in-class starting. So this is especially to the people on Twitch. So after spring break, I think the plan is to meet in class. Okay? Thanks, everybody. Thank you.